notes, what is Erickson's stage for psychosocial development? And we're talking about Erickson. Anyone remember? Excellent. Identity versus role confusion. And then we're not going to review it, but again, make sure you kind of go over your notes several times, the part on the identity statuses that hopefully then lead to Erickson's outcome of identity, or the status of identity achievement related to Erickson's identity positive outcome. We were talking about adolescence and self-esteem. We looked at some kind of general characteristics of self-esteem, and again, if you remember that females tend to experience some somewhat lower drops in self-esteem compared to males, in that it tends to fluctuate some during early adolescence, and then as we get into late adolescence, tend to kind of stabilize and kind of even out. And again, that may be stabilized or even out with a healthy positive or low, depending upon experiences and again, how adolescents have navigated this stage of life. What we want to look at very briefly, the first part of our session, are some factors that influence self-esteem. The first one we've already said a lot about, so we really don't need to discuss it a whole lot more, but has to do with body image. And again, how a teenager feels about themselves, is reflected on their body image, and how closely that resembles their expectations for their body image, and how that compares to society and peers' expectations for, again, how they should look, physically. And again, as we talked about earlier, when the physical changes take place may also impact, an adolescent's self-esteem as well. So body image clearly is one factor. Very much like we talked about a little bit during middle childhood, outward successes and failures that the adolescent might experience. Thinking back on your own teenage years, can you think of either your own experiences or just adolescents in general? Where are the places where they're likely to experience successes and failures? Can you think of some examples? School and sports, and clearly, when we think about school, we think about academics, and again, I think one of the things that happens is grades get emphasized maybe even more importantly than they did in elementary school. I mean, my son brought home the quarter grades last night, and he did really well, and it was really obvious that he felt good about that, and that's something that really kind of boosted self-esteem. It's interesting that you mentioned sports, because at the same time he was bringing his grades home last night, he is in today his final day of tryouts for junior high basketball. And then they will post them either tonight or tomorrow morning. And he'll find, and again, up to this point, he's always played, sports, and it's been a big part of his life and impacting his self-esteem. But now all of a sudden it's different. Just the concept of tryouts and making or not making the team will have an impact. I mean, he'll react to that in terms of whether obviously he makes the team, it's deemed a success. If he doesn't, clearly will feel like a failure in his life, and he clearly expects that he'll make the team. But I mean, they were informed yesterday that there are 24 boys trying out. There's only 15 who will make it. So somebody isn't going to be on the team come next Monday. Where are the other places? Again, we often think about sports, but I don't think that's the only places. Again, in junior high, high school, where teens have to try out and deal with that whole sense of succeeding and failing. Apart from sports, where are some of the other places? Yeah. Driving. And again, whether you pass or don't pass the old driver's test and how many times it takes.
Well, whether you pass it and how many wrecks you have.
How many wrecks you have? I guess maybe with some teenagers, maybe the more wrecks is some sign of status or success, I don't know, but adults and parents would not look at it that way at all. But again, driving, success and failures. Where else?
Being able to fit in with the group that you prefer.
Okay, and we'll talk about that really as a separate factor by itself. Any other places that anyone else try out for anything else in school different from sports? Part-time job. And keeping a part-time job. I was on the debate team, which there was a competitive element to trying out for the debate team and making it. I know there's a certain element of that, or at least in terms of, I wasn't in the band, but I know that there were issues around what chair you were in the band, Included that would impact issues of self-esteem, so, to some degree. I have a family, some friends of ours, daughter is in high school and is in the play. And again, there is the trying out for a part in the play, and then what part you get. And if you don't get a part, again, there's senses of successes and, in failures. So there's, again, a lot of places. And obviously, those teenagers who experience a number of successes in all those, in a variety of different areas, are going to feel better about themselves than those who may feel a sense of having not succeeded in a variety of those areas. And I'm sure that there are more besides the ones that we've already identified. Another important factor, and this is true at every stage, I think, but clearly is an issue during adolescence, is the nature of family life. Virginia Satir, well-known family therapist, in one of her classic books, wrote about what does it feel like, and she talked about family atmospheres. And she said, what's it feel like to be in your family? And how it feels to be in your family is going to have a lot to do with how you feel about yourself. And how your family makes you feel about yourself. And for teenagers who live in a family situation, particularly during this time of very drastic and dramatic changes, to be in a family where you feel cared about, supported, where family members, and particularly parents, are invested and interested in all aspects of your life, who give you encouragement, it clearly is going to impact positively self-esteem versus those family situations where you feel criticized, ridiculed, put down, in family situations where the expectations are far above what you could possibly achieve. And so you never feel like you quite can live up to parents' expectations. And so even maybe when you've done well, you still feel, at least from parents or from family members, a sense of failure. Or those situations, and I don't know if there's anyone in here that kind of fell into that, where you had siblings, who tend to succeed at one place, and then you were expected to live up to the expectations of siblings that was hard to do. And then somehow you always felt like that you weren't maybe quite as good, as that sibling, and didn't get the same reaffirmation or reinforcement, that they may have gotten. So again, that family environment is going to play a key role in terms of how teenagers feel about themselves, as well. And later on, we'll talk more about parenting styles and how that contributes to self-esteem. Clearly, and we'll talk in a moment about the role of peers and friendships, but they become increasingly important. And so at this stage, as the role of peers becomes increasingly important, the nature of those relationships. And again, for those who feel like they have a good network of friends, places where they feel like that they fit in and they belong and they're accepted by that peer group, is going to have a lot to do with how they feel about themselves, versus those teenagers that really struggle with finding a place to fit in, that don't have a peer group that they really identify with, and that a lot of support that comes from dealing with the challenges of the adolescent stage often comes from the peer group. And so just having that strong network of friends becomes really, really important. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then finally, this is the one I think that we often kind of lose sight of, students often forget about on the exam, is that for many teenagers, the relationship with other significant adults, again, this is other than parents, can have a lot to do. And sometimes these other adults, maybe even in some cases more influential to building self-esteem than sometimes parents are in certain areas. Can anybody think of, and you don't need to name names or anything, but can you think of, was there any significant adults other than your parents that played an important role in your life during your teenage years that contributed positively to you feeling good about who you were? I had a scout leader, and I was in scouts during much of my teenage years, that I think was not so much in terms of my relationship with him, but as much as the role that he played in terms of the opportunities he provided for us to be successful in that particular area of our lives. And we did a lot of outdoor kinds of challenging kinds of experiences, always geared towards helping us feel successful and providing experiences where we felt successful. And so I think my confidence in who I was and my abilities were enhanced by that experience. And likewise, I had, when I was in high school, a unique relationship with the high school principal and played a significant role, I think, in helping me decide who I was and who I was wanting to become, and played a key role in supporting some of the changes that that I was going through. Anybody think about significant adults in your life that clearly had a positive impact on your self-esteem? Again, apart from parents. Anybody think of anyone who was significant? Yeah, Kendra?
One of my aunts, ever since I can remember, she always treated me like an adult. She would always talk at my level and valued what I thought and had to say. And that's just grown as, our relationship has grown closer. But when I think of significant people, it's just
Yeah.
she's there.
And an aunt, and again, probably some of it was, my guess is you probably could talk to your aunt about some things that was more difficult to talk about with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that comes from the point that she's not your parent. And so her reaction to some can be very, very different. And again, some of those relatives become critical to helping shape who we were becoming, particularly in terms of our self-esteem. Anyone else think of a significant adult in their life apart from their parents that played an important role? I don't know if that no one wants to identify or whether there was or wasn't. I know sometimes students think about teachers that they had in school that played key roles in really helping them feel not only good about themselves but feeling competent and successful in life. Often students will talk about, for those who were involved in sporting events, we'll often talk about coaches that played key roles in terms of not only the experience of participating in the sport that helped them feel successful and competent, but that relationship with that coach that kind of helped motivate them, helped encourage and kind of maybe push them along to be successful in whatever that sporting activity might have been. So again, a lot of times family plays a key role, peers play a key role, but many times there are other adults as well that are influential in helping to shape not only who we are as a person, but how we feel about that person as well. Okay, factors that influence our self-esteem during this stage. All right, we want to shift and begin to look at aspects of social development. And what we want to focus on initially is looking at the role of peers and what's happening in terms of friendships. And then we'll take a look at relationship with parents and the role that they play in terms of development. Adolescents report fewer close friends than when they were in elementary school, but they tend to become increasingly more intimate and play a more vital role in the teenager's life. Anybody think of a reason why, as we move into this stage, why there may be fewer close friends than we had in elementary school? I mean, I think there are some explanations or some reasons. All right, one is just the fact that you're changing classes, you're not all in the same classroom, and in that process, as a result of that, you tend to become maybe more selective in who you call and identify your close friends. And the foundation for those friendships, clearly begin to emerge and change. Again, they become more intimate, which means there tends to be more of a focus, whereas still in elementary school, a lot of what tends to be the foundation for friendships are activities and things that we share in common that we're interested in. And that still tends to be important during adolescence, in terms of, friends tend to be those that, again, still share common interest, similar activities, compatibility of personalities come into play. But the nature of those friendships begin to evolve and change in the sense that conversations, and the nature of those conversations and the ability to communicate effectively in meaningful ways become more important during this stage than they were during elementary school. And so we begin to become more selective in terms of those that we really feel close to, that we really feel comfortable with, beyond just those that we enjoy spending time with. And so we begin to narrow down the number that we put into that category of close friends. And it's been interesting to watch that already begin to happen with my own son. There's still a number of those boys that he calls friends, but clearly he's begun to define best friends. And those are the ones he clearly spends more time with, those that he clearly enjoys differently. And even though there are some that he clearly still refers to as a friend, you can see the relationship changing some. And he can talk about what's different and why he would rather spend more time with this friend and less time with that friend, even though clearly they fall within that category of important relationships. And one of the things I think that begins to happen as the relationships become more intimate and more close has to do with the nature of the conversation. And all of a sudden we begin to talk about life differently. And we begin to talk about things more than just the things that we're doing together, but in this extent begin to share some aspects of our lives. Again, now without being personal in terms of specifics, what do you remember talking to your friends at this age about, just in terms of topics? You don't have to talk about the specifics of the topics, but...
Honestly.
Huh?
Honestly.
Yeah.
It was about, well, there were a lot of things that we talked about, drinking and
Okay.
alcohol.
Yeah. Again, we're talking about life issues, beginning to talk about drinking and alcohol. Clearly a common topic for many is talking about the other gender, and talking about some of what they think about issues around sexuality that they've been exposed to. And a lot more conversation will center around that topic with peers, often more so than with parents many times. What are other just topics that you remember talking to your best friends about? Again, you're not talking about the specifics, just the topic. I think at least in some friendships, I think clearly there are conversations about families, about parents. My son doesn't have siblings, so there's not much conversation about siblings. But I'm sure he has conversations with his friends about his mom and dad at times, or things we've done or didn't do or shouldn't have done or wish we'd done differently or whatever. But it is interesting to watch those conversations begin to change to being more than just about what the activities are, but really begin to talk about life and talking about, I think, as they evolve through this stage, beginning to share ideas about what they think about and believe about different things. I think it's interesting, even at a very early adolescent age, is to watch, young teenagers begin to talk about something like politics. And again, so much of, at least I find this in my own household, I'm sure my son has been strongly influenced by his mom and dad's political views. But then all of a sudden, as a result of the cognitive things we've already talked about, beginning to think about what he really thinks about some of those issues. And then particularly as he has interactions with other friends whose families may have different political kinds of perspectives and positions, and begin to have those kinds of conversations. So clearly those relationships are changing and becoming more intimate. The nature of those conversations are evolving. The beginning of early adolescent teens spend most of their time still in same-sex groups. Again, young adolescents, junior high kids are still going to spend most of their time typically with their friends who tend to be of the same gender. But one of the things that clearly begins to happen is they spend a lot more time thinking about and talking about the other sex. And then gradually, as they begin to move through early adolescence into late adolescence, those groups will begin to emerge. There'll be more interaction with the other gender. But still, again, when you're thinking about 7th, 8th grade, particularly 7th grade, a lot of the time is still spent with same gender. But it is interesting, again, if you ever have the opportunity to listen to the conversations that they have, and particularly the conversations they have about the other gender, and clearly the interest. It's starting a lot earlier than it did, and it's clearly starting, into late elementary school. But that's still changing, the nature of that. And again, clearly more conversation about who likes who and who's going with who and who's boyfriend and girlfriend, and those kinds of things. I was at a junior high football game the other day, and it's interesting to watch the females in the stand who've got a certain football player's number written across their forehead, and a T-shirt that's got who they're rooting for on, and those kinds of things. And so the interest clearly is is increasing in that area. What we find again during early adolescence is youth tend to form cliques. We've heard that term, thrown that term around a lot over several decades now. But cliques are simply defined as small groups of less than 10. And what we find during early adolescence is youth tend to move in certain small groups. And those small groups may be defined by activities that they're involved in, or they may simply be a group of friends that share, something in common with. Again, you don't have to identify what group you might have been a part of when you were in junior high or high school. But what were some of the cliques that existed? Or what were some of the things that defined what cliques existed? Cheerleaders and jocks, geeks. Okay, what were some of the others? Because some schools have some unique cliques that some of the others don't have. Any? Yeah.
Oh, we had like the thespians hung out together.
Thespians, okay. Yeah, and in some schools that wouldn't necessarily be a group that would be formed, but in some it clearly would be. Other groups that you can think of?
Like the farmers, like work on the farm.
Those that work on the farmers, and some are very clearly defined and even influences how dress. The cliques will often influence language within the group. Any others you can think of? Skaters. Yeah, and which didn't exist in my generation. It kind of evolved after that. We had a clique, and I think the names change. I'm not sure the cliques themselves changed dramatically, but we had it in back in the 60s and 70s, a variety of different terms. But we had the potheads. Now I know the name has changed today, but there clearly was that group that what brought them together was their recreational activities around illicit drugs. Any other groups you can think of?
Gothics.
Huh? The Gothics, yeah. And again, that was not a group that was very prominent, again, when I was in junior and high school, but clearly has evolved, in this generation of adolescents. Excellent example. Any other unique cliques? Anyone in their school have a clique that wasn't necessarily defined by some of the common terms, but there was something unique that just brought that group of 10 together? Because some of them are, the stereotypes tend to clearly, fit in terms of, geeks, athletes, those things that tend to characterize a group. Anybody think of any unique characteristics? Or you might have been a part of a unique group.
I don't know, our neighborhood just hung out together.
Excellent. Just your neighborhood. Good example. And again, my life was kind of like that way because, as I mentioned earlier in the semester, grew up in an unusual situation of living on this private lake. And there wasn't a lot of other things going on. There, as I mentioned before, there wasn't a lot of other activities to be involved in terms of malls and, video games, and a lot of those kinds of things weren't as prevalent. Even minimal opportunities to go to movies and stuff. So the lake was our social world. And so there was this group of us that lived on the lake, and that was, to a large extent, one of our cliques, without a doubt. And we all moved together, did things together. And what was interesting is that what brought us together, but within that group, we were all different. Some were clearly much more geeks, and then there were some that played sports. There were some that financially were much better off than others in the group. And so actually our group was made up of individuals who were also then a part of some other clique as well. But that commonality of our neighborhood or where we lived is what brought this group together, and we spent a tremendous amount of time together.
Our group was definitely not safe. But
Good example of the high-risk behaviors that some adolescents might engage in, swinging around on an inner tube at 40 miles an hour. I know, I'm just kidding, but, and again, the basic belief that, that everything would be, and obviously, hopefully, it was. But again, and a lot of us probably can think of, again, examples, and again, that commonality of a place where most of you tended to kind of hang out and spend, and spend time together. And again, an example of how a group, kind of existed for a major part of not only your adolescent years, but one that kind of continued even,
we're still
even
all
beyond
close.
that.
I mean, we live throughout the parts of the country. It originated in Wichita, is where we,
Yeah.
in northwest Wichita.
So you still get back together at the same house?
No, the parents eventually sold the house.
Yeah.
But they ended up moving to Lake the Ozarks, the parents did, but even when they had started going over to Lake the Ozarks, the house would be empty for quite a while. It would just be like our little domain.
Your little.
Or a big domain, actually.
Kind of sounds like, as you were sharing that, kind of reminded me of the example of the clubhouse. Yeah, but very extravagant, really nice kind of clubhouse where people kind of gathered to do stuff and kind of hang out, and it's great that there was someone who would open the house up like that, and probably
Sometimes it worked out,
sometimes it didn't. Yeah, but anyway, what we tend to find is many tend to kind of move into, and again, not necessarily using that term negatively. Sometimes we think of clique and kind of define that negatively. I think the cliques and the small groups play a really significant role in the sense that, one of the things that's happening that we'll talk a little bit more about is that, clearly we, as we think about that identity formation, and there is this clearly continued movement of the adolescent or the youth from the world of the parents, and again, more independence, more freedom. And the problem is in the midst of that transition and those changes, there's still the need, even though I'm feeling this need or this kind of push to kind of break away some more from my parents, the problem is that I often find it difficult to make just a total break without still feeling connected someplace. And so those small groups are kind of that place where I feel connected, I feel like I belong, that I get a sense of security, where I feel accepted, which is really interesting because we talk about that desire to be unique and to be special, and yet in early adolescence we find ourselves connecting with others where in a lot of ways we're very, very similar, in terms of our interest and in some cases even how we dress, the music we listen to, those kinds of things. But it is that place where we feel a sense of connectedness that I think allows us to begin to make, in some ways, that final kind of break in separating, from family. And I don't mean separating where we're not connected to family, but we're becoming more and more our own person and more, independent. And the clique or the small group, I think, helps enable that. And particularly if that small group, that clique, is a positive group. And again, it can have negative influences or it can have very positive influences in terms of reinforcing and encouraging, healthy kinds of behaviors as well. And we sometimes tend to characterize those as being somewhat negative. But many adolescents will have found themselves in one or more small groups. Now, what does tend to happen in many cases is that during late adolescence, the peer group tends to be larger. And in many cases, the clique per se, there's still that network of friends that may have been a part of the clique, but the association with the group may begin to diminish and become less important. Can you think of reasons why? Why might some of the cliques and being a part of a more defined clique begin to be replaced by a larger peer group? And again, you look at late adolescence, by the time people are juniors and seniors, a lot of times don't associate themselves specifically with a group that they may have when they were in junior high.
I think,
Yeah.
To find identity within a smaller group, once they've established it, they're more able to feel comfortable around more people, larger groups.
Excellent. And I think that's part of the hope, is that as I kind of go through this evolutionary process of developing my own identity, the peer group may kind of been an important part. I mean, that clique or that small group initially, may have been a place where I began to do that. But at some point in time, hopefully what begins to happen is that I really begin to define who I am and who I want to be that isn't necessarily tied directly to a group. And so now I don't necessarily need the group per se, that I fit in or feel accepted, to feel okay about myself, because now I feel good about who I am and who I've become. It doesn't mean I give up the friendships, but the need to feel the identification with a group may not be quite as strong. And also what may begin to happen, in I think many cases, is all of a sudden you begin to largen that peer group to where all of a sudden some of the people that you associate with and interact with may very well have been a part of other cliques that in junior high you would never have what? Associated with. I think it's old and it's classic. But I think what's most characteristic of that is the Breakfast Club. And again, for those of you who remember the movie The Breakfast Club, literally what you had pulled together for detention was, and I don't remember exactly how many there were 6 or 7 or however many in detention, really represented individuals from what? Almost totally different cliques. And I mean, you had almost every segment of cliques represented. But all of a sudden now they found themselves for this period of time in one group. All realizing really two things. And for those who remember the movie, what do you think they realized? I think they realized a couple of things. One of the things I think they initially they were very much aware of how different they were. And we saw all the initial conflict that surfaced at the very beginning of their interaction together. But I think the conclusion that they came to at the end of that experience was really how much they shared in common, and that they really had a whole lot more in common in terms of life than they realized. But they also still struggled with the fact that what do we do with the fact that we really are more alike than we are different? But yet if you remember those conversations about what it means when we leave this place and then go back into the larger school setting, can we still consider ourselves friends? And they really struggled with that question because each one was then going back to their own clique, their own peer group, that in those groups were often non-accepting of those from the other small groups or other cliques,
I have something that's really similar to that. I have more on our heads, just
Yeah. And a good example of a real life situation of really dealing with those struggles, and then how do I, in an experience like that, of where some of who I am and how I see myself changes over that 3-day period. And so how do I live out those changes and be true to myself and yet still deal with the groups that I move in or have moved in prior to that weekend on an everyday basis? And then how do I relate to those that 3 days ago I saw as being very different than me, that I'm not sure I even liked or accepted, and then all of a sudden begin to realize, that I do. And I think hopefully by the time that when we get to junior high, get to be juniors and seniors and getting ready to graduate, that all of a sudden we begin to break down some of those stereotypes and some of the images we have, and then we begin to relate to peers as peers, and actually begin to relate to peers that may be very, very different than we are, and they may not necessarily ever fall into being, quote, our close friends, but our association, our interaction with them begins to change. And so our group begins to widen, I think, in terms of who we interact with, and not necessarily who we hang out with, but at least who we socialize with, particularly within that school setting. And again, I think a lot more life begins to evolve around the common school events and activities that become more important than the individual groups within those. And again, that doesn't happen for all, but does tend to be the pattern. And so again, we tend to see cliques being more common in early adolescence, less important in late adolescence. Popularity is more important during early adolescence, and peer pressure and conformity decreases during late adolescence. And again, I think some of this we've already kind of explained why that is. Again, there tends to be more peer conformity. A lot of it's related to those small groups or those cliques that need to fit in, need to feel accepted, need to feel that kind of sense of belonging someplace. Being popular tends to be real important during early adolescence, necessarily being, perceived to be, in terms of the status of popularity that comes with it. Why do you think that tends to diminish by the time I'm a junior or senior? Afterwards you begin to realize that life is bigger than this moment. That isn't going to be necessarily your circle of relationships. And then just the whole issue of being popular. Again, important that I have friends and that I fit in and that I belong, but the whole concept of being popular within that broader school setting all of a sudden doesn't tend to carry as much weight or as much importance. One of the things I've always was intrigued with, and if I ever had time and just wanted to do it, was just a study, and I don't know if your school, but you remember in the yearbook, you always had, these different categories. The person who is most likely to succeed, or whatever they were. And I always wondered where they were at 20 years down the road, And we never had the category of, number one loser, But I think there was the perception of those who, and I wonder how many of those who were not popular, who again were maybe part of those other groups that we talked about. I wonder how many of those rose to the top in terms of success, and how many of those who supposedly were to be the ones the most likely to succeed didn't, who didn't have the successes that they were projected to have. And I know in terms of some of the kids that I went to high school with that clearly were the ones who were always in the yearbook, really, and were the popular ones, knew where they were even 4 years later. Didn't live out what some of those expectations were based on, again, school popularity. And I think as we move through and we get to those, and all of a sudden we find out that some of the foundations for popularity don't tend to be that important. All of a sudden we begin to realize that there are other things probably more important, than the fact that I succeeded, on one of the sporting events, or that was a cheerleader, or that I had lots of money, or whatever it was that we used as the criteria for being popular. All of a sudden, doesn't seem to be that important. And I think part of it is, again, in that search of identity, both in terms of who I want to be and what's important, and what I want to do with my life and what I value, and as that begins to emerge and evolve. And then, again, friends are still important. But I still don't feel that need to have to conform and be like my friends in every way to be accepted by them, And there's some struggle in that sometimes, in terms of realizing who I want to be and making some of those changes, realizing that it could impact my peer group. I remember losing, or at least a very close friendship I had for almost my entire junior high, senior high year, changing because of some of the changes that I went through and how I saw myself and the person I wanted to be changed and wasn't as compatible with who he was. And that was difficult. And that happened when I was a junior in high school. But being true to myself and who I was becoming was more important than necessarily being liked or accepted by even a very, very close friend. So again, popularity, peer pressure, all begin to decrease as we move into later adolescence. Couple of last-minute things real quickly. These two are really kind of related. Males seem to have as many best friends as females, but they do tend to interact with more people than females do. And some of that may be just by virtue of the kinds of activities they're involved in. But again, in terms of best friends, both are going to identify pretty much the pretty similar number of best friends. But the circles that they move in will change. I mean, probably the simplest example I remember during the time that I was in high school, particularly during the fall, and there was probably something different every season, but almost every Sunday a group of us got together in the afternoon and played tackle football. Just a pickup game of football. And we did that virtually every Sunday afternoon, and that's what we did. And there would be, any number of us. And then there were even times when in the lake community that I lived in, we traveled into the town that we went to school in and played some group from there. Again, kind of those high-risk behaviors when you think about it. No pads, nothing, tackle football, all out, kinds of things. And so it wasn't uncommon at times for us to move in a larger group in terms of activities that we were involved in. But when it came to those intimate friendships, tend to be very, very, very similar. Male friendships focus less on conversation and more on shared activity. And again, we've talked about this previously. And tends to be true. And the conversations we have tend to center much more around still the activity in comparison to females, who do tend to be much more open about talking about life, talking about experiences, those kinds of things. And finally, peer influence tends to be related to day-to-day social matters. And again, and particularly if adolescents have a good relationship with their family and their parents still, and we'll talk more about this later, parents still tend to have a strong influence on the really important decisions and issues of life. But what are some of the things that friends tend to have a pretty strong influence on? And what do we mean by day-to-day matters? And again, if you think back to your junior high, high school years, where are the places that peers, friends probably influenced choices that you made more so maybe than parents? And even though the situations and circumstances changed, a lot of them have remained the same from one generation to another. Clothing is a big one. And now, if you look at the styles of the 70s, clearly are different than the styles of the 90s and the 2000s. But peers tend to have a lot of influence over what are the appropriate clothes to wear. What else? The things that peers tend to have an influence over day to day. Okay, who you can talk to? Who you date. Excellent. What else? Where you go hang out. And where we're going to go hang out this Friday or after school or whatever, they play a big role. What else? Real quickly, a couple other examples. Hairstyles. Exactly. Type of music. Within my group, language. It's amazing if you think about some of the language and vocabulary we had when I was in high school. It's hard to imagine that those words came out of our mouths so frequently and often did within our group. We were very careful about what we used, where we used outside of that group, but we clearly had our own vocabulary within our kind of inner circle. Yeah, and so those are the places where peers tend to have a lot of influence. And again, depending upon the nature of a relationship with parents, they may have even a stronger influence in other areas. And next time we'll talk about parent-teen relationships and then different parenting styles within the midst of that.